So today we are going to be talking about my best books of 2022. Now there are only 5 this year. I've talked a lot about, I guess, why there's only 5. I also feel like the longer I read, the more I talk about books in depth, the more it takes a book to impress me, especially when we're talking about fantasy. So what you're going to notice in this top 5, these are the best of the best, and it's because they elicited a response from me on another level. In a lot of instances with this top 5, they engaged me emotionally, which is always something that I value above anything else, because I'm not an emotional reader. I won't cry at just anything. I won't be swept away emotionally by just anything. So when I am engaged on that level, then books tend to be a little bit higher rated from me. But we are going to find that there is not as much fantasy on here as you guys would expect, and I did read a lot of great fantasy in 2022, but I didn't give a lot of fantasy 5 stars. So this is essentially going to be the first part of my best of 2022. These are my top 5, like the 5 books I read that have made it to my new favorites, which is what this video means to me, because I do have other 5-star reads, but like a lot of them, like I think I rated 8 volumes of Saga 5 stars and I had around 25 stars in total. So these are the best of the best. These are the new favorites. And then we're going to have a follow-up video of 10 honorable mentions, the majority of which are those really great fantasy books that I just mentioned to you guys I read this year, or last year should I say, but they just weren't 5 stars because I'm maybe a little bit more critical of fantasy, or because they just didn't reach that like 5-star status from me. And I am, like I said, a little bit more picky about fantasy because I do read so much of it. So the 5 books we're talking about today are going to be a mix of fantasy, romance, contemporary romance, and fantasy. My best book of the year may shock you. It definitely shocked me, but we are going to be talking about these books kind of in order. The books in first and second are definitely interchangeable, and the rest of them can like move rankings throughout this top 5 depending on my mood. But the first one we're going to be talking about is the only book that I don't have a physical copy of yet, which is Her Soul to Take by Harley LaRue. I call it fantasy romance because it deals with like gods and demons, but a lot of people would consider this paranormal. And something that I really loved about it actually is that it has a classic paranormal atmosphere. But this is a series, I think it's going to be a trilogy that follows 3 different couples all centered around this town. And in book 1, Her Soul to Take, we are following a young woman called Ray who has moved back to the town that her family is from. She has a YouTube channel where she does like paranormal investigations, and she is a little bit annoyed at people using shock tactics and not being genuine to push themselves up like the YouTube algorithm and get more views than her. So she stumbles across a grimoire and she decides to do a demon summoning that she doesn't think is actually going to produce any real results, and lo and behold it does, and she ends up summoning a demon called Leon. Now Leon has actually been used by the most influential family in this town for a very long time to kill people or like sacrifice people to a god that slumbers under the town. So when Leon is summoned by Ray, he asks for the grimoire back so that he can finally have his freedom because nobody will be able to summon him, and she discovers that it has been stolen. So they work together to try and find this grimoire so that Leon can have his freedom, and also so that Ray can get to the bottom of like the sacrifices that are going on in the town. Now this is a little bit of a spicy one, and it does on Goodreads, there is like a full kink list and content warning list if that is something that you guys would maybe need to check. It does dip into BDSM a little bit, but I did really like the romance throughout it. I liked the dynamic between Ray and Leon. I really did like the smut in here as well. But my favorite thing about this is that the atmosphere was transportative. So back in the day, like I read Twilight when I was 13 in 2006 when the book was actually published, and before that I'd been a massive fan, as you guys know, of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I'd grown up with a lot of paranormal, so when we got into this period of time where things like Twilight and The Wolves of Mercy Falls and all that kind of like vampire and werewolf fiction was the biggest thing, I read a lot of it. One of my favorite series is the Hush Hush series by Becca Fitzpatrick as well, and the atmosphere in this book was very reminiscent of Bella Swan arriving at Forks for the first time. It was very much like Nora in the Hush Hush series, and I loved that about it. Obviously the content within here is a lot more adult, but I feel like if you, like me, were a fan of those kind of books in that time period, this is a transportative book which will mentally like put you in that place, and it appealed to me very much on the things that I used to love as opposed to the things that I love now. But then when we get into the romance and the smut, that does appeal to like the kind of thing that I'm into now. I will say as well that this does have a decent plot that goes alongside it, because I do find sometimes with books like this, the plot is kind of just something that very loosely holds together the romance. I did actually really enjoy the plot in this one. My only kind of criticism is that we do see the characters from the following books in this one, but it feels like they're working alongside the plot, but because they're not the couple that we're following, they're not at the forefront of the story. So they're doing important things, but we don't get to see it because they're not the focus. I still not have continued on with this series. I am very excited to. I am a little bit hesitant because I don't typically love books that follow different couples in every installment. I like a fantasy romance that follows the same kind of couple and a strong cast of supporting side characters throughout the entire thing. But I've heard very good things about book 2, and this took me by surprise, which I think is how I ended up getting 5 stars and ended up on my best of the year list. Coming in at number 4 on this list, we have Beautiful Nightmares by KJ Sutton. This one is the 4th installment in the Fortune of Swan series, which is one of my favorite fantasy romances of all time and probably my favorite indie series of all time. I am good friends with the author, but I do just want to clarify that my friendship with the author came after I'd enjoyed this series. It wasn't like a precursor, like I'm friends with Kelsey, so I have to love her series. But this one is a fairy romance story, and our main character is Fortuna, who is actually a nightmare, which means that she can make you believe you're experiencing your worst nightmares. So at the beginning of this series, her brother has gone missing, and she's been searching for him for 2 years and literally has not found a single trace. So she is actually the last of her kind at this point, along with her brother who's missing, and she's given up hope on ever finding him up until a very powerful fairy male approaches her and says, "I will help you find your brother, provided that you marry me." So this sets off a whole chain of events that Fortuna is very much in the center of. I adored the first 3 books in this series, but I love this one even more. This is my favorite installment in the series so far, and that is because even though I did give books 1 and 2 5 stars, I did have a little bit of an issue with the pacing in them, in that I thought they were too fast paced and we had just a little bit too much plot. Like, you could have trimmed a couple of plot elements out and it would have still been a really strong book, but it would have had more room within the text to like support this plot. This has ironed out the pacing perfectly for me. It is a chunky one. It is just past 700 pages. It's 715, and I know that Kelsey had to make the text smaller to be able to get it into a size that Amazon would publish, so it is a thick book. But what we have in here is the same amount of plot as we had in like Restless Slumber, although things are developing and getting more complex with every book. But we also have a lot of slow moments throughout here that really just made this the perfect Fortuna book for me. The one thing that didn't make it the perfect Fortuna book was the love interest in here, because throughout this series our main character kind of wavers backwards and forwards. We have a couple of love interests, and this one focused on a love interest who is not my personal preference, but I do like him as a character and I enjoyed this. Like, even though he's not my preference, I'm loyal to a fault. He will never be my preference as much as I love him, but I enjoyed him being the center of the romance in here. The only sad thing about it is that obviously like I have my preference and I would rather he was the center of the romance. Something that I do really love about this series as a whole as well is that Kelsey doesn't pull her punches, which is especially evident I would say in Restless Slumber and Deadly Dreams. And I was really happy to see in Beautiful Nightmares that while it's still a little bit brutal, while it's still a little bit dark, there wasn't the gut-wrenching moment like we had in the past 2 books. So it was a little bit of a break, but that just means to me that I know it's coming. Like, I know that something terrible is gonna happen. And am I ready for it? Absolutely not. But will I eat it up? Absolutely yes. So moving on to my 3rd best book of the year, that one is The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. I do know that there are some issues with this book, and I will link the vlog that I talked about them up here for you guys if you kind of want to see what they are and see what I'm have to say about them, because I intentionally went into it in that vlog as like a point of reference so that I didn't have to go into it every time I mention this, because it is like it's a topic with a lot of nuance that deserves to be talked about in length and not paraphrased for the sake of saving time. I would describe it as kind of a cozy fantasy. It's not quite, but it has cozy fantasy vibes, and it is about a guy called, I think he's Linus Baker, yes, he works for a kind of like social services for magical children, and he's always believed in his job, and he thinks that he's doing a good thing when he goes to these orphanages and like foster homes and reports any kind of situations, and he wants everything done by the book, like done by government regulations, and he thinks that he's being a good guy by doing this job. But he's also living a very stagnant life. Like, he's not progressing in his career. He's quite happy where he is, even though it's like is it entry level? Like between an entry level and a mid-level position. He's not progressing his personal life in any way. He just kind of has the same routine every day. And one day he's taken into the office of extremely upper management, and he's given this top secret mission to visit this orphanage, which is the house in the Cerulean Sea, and tell extremely upper management whether these children are okay, whether the guy looking after them is doing a good job, and whether they are a danger to society, because these are the most dangerous children. So Linus goes to the house in the Cerulean Sea, and he starts to get to know these children and the guy who runs the orphanage, and throughout this process he starts to also live his life and break out of this like stagnant routine that he's been in for the longest time. But this was emotionally engaging in a way that I didn't necessarily expect. I knew that it was emotional because a bunch of people adored this and had said it was like the sweetest, most wholesome thing, but I didn't know that it would affect me because, as I said, I'm not the most emotional person, but it truly did. I am a very cynical person, so I really enjoy like cozy stories like this that highlight the best in people and make me kind of feel those heartwarming, wholesome vibes that I just typically don't, because I think humanity's the worst, man. Like, I'm not a fan. So anything that like highlights the good, highlights the wholesome, I do tend to enjoy, because I don't know, it hits me on a deeper level where I kind of feel like I've been like fine-tuned to always be disappointed, so never believe in anything other than disappointment and pain. And I don't know, I guess books like this remind me that there is actually good in the world. This is a queer book as well, and it does feature a queer romance, which I really loved. There was one moment in this relationship that broke me, that oh god, like every time I think of that scene, like I feel my stomach drop. But overall, this had a great impact on me. I didn't think that TJ Klune was an author for me. I also didn't think that cozy stories were a thing for me until I realized that I actually really like Becky Chambers and always have, and she writes, I guess, typically this kind of thing, but in a sci-fi setting. So yeah, I'm a fan. Who knew that who likes my grimdark, my pain, who knew that I would like cozy stories like this? Now, the two interchangeable ones, we're gonna put the fantasy one in at number 2, which is of course Assassin's Fate by Robin Hobb, the final book in the realm of the Eldlings. Man, have we been on a journey. If you guys are new to my channel, I've had a book club since 2018, but since 2020 we have been reading the realm of the Eldlings. It is a 16 book series. Oh my god, this is a heart-wrenching one. This is the kind of thing that you would expect to be on my favorites of the year list, because this is pure pain. But I can't tell you too much about this particular installment. For you guys who've missed my synopsis of the realm of the Eldlings, here we go again. The realm of the Eldlings is a epic fantasy universe that's broken down into 5 series, and series 1, 3 and 5 follow a character called Fitzchivalry Farseer. He's actually the bastard son of Prince Chivalry, and when he was a very small child he was given away by his maternal grandfather, who didn't want anything to do with him and wanted him to go back to his father. So Fitz is shepherded back to the seat of the crown, where he finds out that his father has had word of his approach and abdicated the throne and disappeared in shame. So nobody really knows what to do with Fitz, and he is majorly raised by the stable master Burrich up until he comes of an age where the king starts to take an interest in him and starts training him to become the royal assassin. So from the very first page of this series, Fitz's life is pure pain. He's shuffled from pillar to post, he's manipulated, he's taken advantage of, he's used by the people who are supposed to care about him, he loses some of the most important people in his life, he's betrayed by people who should be the most important people in his life, and it's just a hard, painful slog that has, like, ultimately this series is about love and it's about hope and it's about goodness, but there's a lot of badness in here as well. So when I got to this one, I knew that this was going to be pure pain. Like, I just knew that there was no way that Fitz's story could end in a way that didn't shatter me into pieces, and my god, did it. This is definitely a flawed book in that it does have some of the characters that we come to know and love in series 2 and 4 in the Realm of the Eldlings, but some of the things that they're doing happen off page in a way that I kind of wish we had a companion, or that this was like maybe even longer and like a multi-perspective novel. It is, but more of a multi-perspective novel that included characters from the Realm of the Eldlings as a whole, as opposed to just characters from the Fitz saga. Something that I've always loved about Robin Hobb the entire time that we've been reading this is how thoughtful an author she is, and how comforting and just thoughtful the prose is, in a way that like sucks you in and holds you there. The way that she can manipulate, I say manipulate your emotions in terms of like being a good writer, but the way that she can just write things in a way about fictional characters that are so painful. Some of the things that happen in this book I knew were coming, just like when I read Fool's Errand last year or 2021. I knew that something was coming, but the way that it was written broke me, even though I was fully expecting it. Like, they didn't come out of left field. I knew it was going to happen, but the way that she wrote it was in such a powerful way that it absolutely destroyed me. So this is on my best books of the year because I loved it, because it was so emotionally engaging on a multitude of levels. Like, there's just when you know that things aren't going to be okay, but she makes you think things are going to be okay, and then they're not, you get that sinking feeling of dread. She is a master of fantasy. I'm really excited to read the Soldier Son series by Robin Hobb, although I know I've been warned that it isn't quite as good as the Realm of the Eldlings, but honestly I don't think there's a lot that can be as good as the Realm of the Eldlings. But yeah, so it's on here because I loved it, it's on here because it emotionally engaged me, it's on here because it's the end of an era, and Robin Hobb is for sure one of my favorite authors. Now, I hesitate to say that because for an author to be a favorite, I have to 5-star multiple of their series if they're like series writers, or standalones if they're standalone writers. Whereas while I've read 5 different series in this world, it is still in this world. But I think after having read 16 books by one author, I can solidly say, if nothing else, that this is one of my favorite series of all time. But I think I can also say that Robin Hobb is one of my favorite authors. And the final book, my absolute best book of the year, tied with Assassin's Fate, because the thing about these books is that while I loved them both, they're rated on very different scales, because they are very different kinds of books. And I did put a poll on Instagram actually. I asked you if you wanted me to split my best books of the year down between my top 5 and my 10 honorable mentions, or whether you wanted me to split it between fantasy and romance, because the way that I rate them and feel about those two genres, which are my 2 favorite genres, are very different. And you guys wanted to see the top 5 and then the 10 honorable mentions. So my favorite book of 2022 took me by surprise, didn't even want to read it, but it is The Hating Game by Sally Thorne. This book has lived in my mind rent-free since I read it in March. And I do think, while I adored it, while I'm desperate to reread it, while I think about Joshua Templeman daily, I do think that this hit me at the right time, because I actually read this book when I had COVID. I read like 3 romances back to back over the weekend that I had COVID, and by the time I got to this one, this was the last one, I was getting a little bit burned out. I didn't want to read it. I ended up loving it, but then shortly after that, I think it was less than a month after that, is when my mental health started to get really bad. And I think that this book, and also the movie, because the movie isn't that good, but I like the movie because if I want the story, if I want the tone in like a short dose, the movie is perfect. So while my mental health was terrible, I spent a lot of time in the bath watching the movie. So I feel like this found me at the right time, and that is why I love this so much. But if you guys don't know, this is a contemporary romance. I know, contemporary romance, my best book of the year, who am I? That follows 2 people who work for a publishing company that's actually merged. So these 2 publishing companies used to be separate, but they were on the verge of financial collapse, so they decided to merge, but they have very different ethics. So one of the companies value literature as like an art form, and the other side of the company just see literature as like something to sell. Like, they want the marketable trash, essentially. When these 2 companies merged, they kept both of the CEOs, and the main characters of this book, Josh and Lucy, are the assistants to those CEOs, and they despise each other. They very much represent the core ideology of the companies that they work for. Lucy works for the one that values literature as an art, and Josh works for the other one, like he's a business guy. So the CEOs have introduced a new position into this company that Josh and Lucy are both very qualified for, and it's pretty much guaranteed that one of them is going to get it, but they despise each other so much that they make a pact that if one of them gets this job, then the other one's going to quit. So in their day-to-day at work, they have little things that they do intentionally to irritate each other. So it's really petty and it's really childish, a lot of it. So like they will have staring competitions to force the other one to like back down, and the person who like blinks is obviously the loser. So they do like really petty shit like that. I just love this book so much. Joshua Templeman is my ideal man. Like I have noticed through reading contemporary romance this year that I really love a love interest that is the gorgeous, stunning, like pretty boy, because of course I do, I am who I am, but who resents having like the player label and resents people thinking that they're a fuckboy when they're not. I also really love the trope of somebody looking after you when you're sick, but especially when you don't expect them to because you don't think that they're a good person. So I love somebody as a love interest who has this hard, unapproachable exterior but isn't necessarily actually like that. And like, is it because that's me? Possibly, but I'm a sucker for it. The way that like things throughout this book just became more and more apparent, and the main character just kind of like had no idea, and then the revelation at the plot twist at the end. It's a contemporary romance. That's pretty much all I can say about it, because like anything else would be spoilers. You need to experience it for yourself. But if you like a hate to love romance, it's also an office romance, and this might be for you. I will say that it has a very distinctive writing style that takes a little bit of time to get into, just as you're like adjusting to it. Oh, and the reason why you don't know where this book is set is intentional, because Sally Thorne wanted it to be like you can insert it into any kind of place that you're familiar with. Because when I read this, I had a lot of people asking like what city it's set in. Because it's never mentioned, and that's intentional. It's like a blank slate so that it feels relatable and familiar no matter where or when you're kind of reading this book. So there you have it. Those are my 5 best books. We have a little bit of a color theme going on here. There's a lot of pink and blue. If I had a physical copy of Her Soul to Take, it would 100% ruin this aesthetic, but this is not my aesthetic. These are very pastel books. But these are my top 5 books of 2022. If you are normally familiar with my fantasy reading and my fantasy recommendations, then do please stay tuned for the honorable mentions, because that stack of books is more what you would expect from a best books of the year for me. I feel like the more that I read, I value things that kind of like shock me and are new experiences for me more than anything, because I'm more critical of, I guess, the familiar. So yeah, that's why I think this stack of books is a little bit unusual for my normal reading tastes. But down in my comments, please let me know what your best book of 2022 is, and also if you have a little bit of time, maybe also let me know why you loved it so much. But that is it for my best books of 2022. I hope you guys also had a fabulous reading year. If you did like this video, then please don't forget to like it and also subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish Candle website, the Etsy for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.